Greetings, YouTube. I am the Great Jacini, and this is Europe. I've lived here for many, many years in the old country, here on the continent. I speak French and I speak Italian, as well as my English, as you can see, is pretty good. And I thought I might be able to provide a little bit of alternative point of view, maybe some extra information that otherwise you wouldn't have. As we all know, the regular traditional legacy media more or less filters everything you hear and wants to condition your opinion as opposed to informing it. So we got to remember there is journalism, there's fact-based journalism, there's then opinion based on those facts, and we can agree or not what the facts are. But the more information there is, perhaps the better opinion you can make. So that's what I would like to be able to contribute since I am over here, and maybe something a little different. That's why I feel like I'm within my rights to presume to have something that somebody might want to hear. I've been truly inspired these past months by all these people out there on YouTube, people like The Amazing Atheist and Styx and others, articulate, smart, oftentimes funny. And it's the wave of the future. We are in a revolutionary period where these traditional media sources no longer control the narrative. That's a good thing. Sooner or later, anyone who's observant can tell the difference between what is fake news and what is not fake news simply by how much the reading of the situation and the way it's reported will correspond with reality and the consequences and the outcomes where events are taking place. So it's for you to decide, it's for you to judge, and it's certainly not for CNN or any of these other jokers to tell you or anybody else what is and what is not fake news. Read it all, decide for yourself. That's what I say. So anyway, what's going on over here? You may have heard there's going to be a referendum in Italy this Sunday in a mere 48 hours. Unlike the United States, there is media silence 24 hours before any kind of election. We are Friday. That means tomorrow, zero. It's ghost town media-wise. And then Sunday, there will be the vote. It's a referendum for a constitutional reform that was undertaken by the current government led by Matteo Renzi, who was, up until a couple years ago, the mayor of Florence. Now, Italy is a very particular country, a very particular history. It's different than anywhere else, just like everywhere else. I think the easiest way for my American listeners to understand is maybe by telling you what it has in common, and then give you a little bit of what are the differences, because that's really the premise to understand why we are where we at, is understanding how we got here. So first of all, like I think America and like Western liberal democracies all around, the traditional parties no longer really represent various points of view. They all pretty much represent the interests of the global elite, the banking, the multinationals, and all that stuff. So same thing everywhere. I think personally what happened in the States, you can debate to what degree Trump represents these traditional elites, but there's no question that he scared them, and he basically hijacked the Republican Party from the traditional people who, in fact, do the bidding of those forces. Here in Italy, the same thing has happened. What is called the Democratic Party here, the Partito Democratico, the PD, is basically the latest transformation over about a generation of what was originally the Communist Party. And the Communist Party in Italy came out of World War II, and these were the fierce resistance fighters and so on, that along with the more traditional capitalist forces basically created a social compact that led to the great boom years after the war, 50s, 60s, and 70s and stuff. So what has happened to that party? Well, there's probably a few die-hard people that remember that past that are still voting for the PD in spite of all evidence that they no longer represent any of those popular, populist, working-class interests, because they don't. Just like everywhere else, they talk the talk of social justice and all those kind of things, but basically what they've done is, to the best of their ability, to dismantle the welfare state, the health system, and all that stuff, and do the bidding of the European Union, which is to open the borders, to social dumping, to lower wages, to basically maximize profit at the expense of everything else, including the social fabric, cohesion, and peace that these countries typically knew up until these last years of global turbo capitalism and all that it has entailed, all of that disruption that's going on and that we're seeing the reaction to. So that's what's happened. The PD represents that. What had been the right wing, that had already been hijacked by Silvio Berlusconi, who the media mogul who took over what were more or less considered the right wing forces 20 years ago. He's often compared to Trump, but there are some major differences. He was already a media mogul. He's much closer to somebody like Rupert Murdoch taking over the United States than Trump. He owned the media. And here in Italy, you have 3 state television stations. So if the owner of what was the private media then becomes prime minister, which Silvio Berlusconi was a great deal of the time, that meant that he controlled both the private media, because he owned those 3 channels, and then the state media, which was another 3 channels in the radio. And in fact, he fired people who wouldn't toe the line or were reporting things that were inconvenient to him and so on. So that's just one aspect of his rule, and also the reason why he originally, well, many people would say the reason why he came into politics is because his going to jail was imminent, in the sense that there was just too much corruption, too many things, hands in too many pockets, all that kind of stuff. And of course, by becoming a politician, joining that, he got immunity. So there are things like that that are totally different than the States. So Berlusconi and Trump are not really particularly comparable, other than being charismatic and also selling themselves as populists and whatever. Berlusconi, during all of his years of rule, pretty much only ever took care of himself and his vast wealthy interests and things like that. So that's where that stands. So that's what happened to the right. Then the left basically has been subverted and taken over and hollowed out by these same globalist forces, and that's what's left of the PD, which is now run by Renzi. So it had run out of steam, run out of credibility. So what did they do? Put a new young face. This guy's younger than me. And he's just, again, doing the same old stuff. So why this constitutional reform this next Sunday? They came into power without being elected. This is a parliamentary system. It's totally different than the United States in that sense, where you have the president with an enormous amount of executive power. The government can't fall in the United States in that sense. Whereas here, when you have an election and parties are elected, there aren't parties that get 50% or a majority of the vote. A powerful party here gets 30%, and then they have to make coalitions and so on. So basically, the coalition that barely squeaked in was a non-existent one without a mandate. The PD won that election 4 years ago by like half a percentage point. And that's where the Five-Star Movement comes into the story. Now, the Five-Star Movement is totally a recent phenomena, and what is often called a comic, Beppe Grillo, he's much more of a political satirist and an incredibly intelligent and very funny person. He started this movement before that election, where he started recruiting people to run for office on a local level, because he was, in fact, just so utterly disgusted with how corrupt this system was. To give you just a simple example, I went to one of his shows before he had fully joined the political process, so this was like 6 or 7 years ago, and I was astounded with the stuff that he put on this PowerPoint presentation in his theatrical performance, where the last government of that time that had been supposedly a left-wing government, which I had in fact voted for, the main thing they had done in their 2 years in power was simply what they call an amnesty, because under the pretext that the prisons were so overcrowded. And who did they let out of jail? And he went through the list, and he just showed them all. They were all white-collar criminals and politicians who had taken exorbitant amounts of money. They had gutted the health system, diverted funds here and there, and all of them walked. All of them walked. And this was during what was supposedly the Democratic left during their time in power. So it was very sobering, and he, in fact, out of this outrage at such a corrupt system on so many levels, started this party. So that's where it came from. When they won such a massive amount of the vote in that parliamentary election now 4 years ago, It was a surprise, of course, to everybody because the traditional parties, the traditional media, they were just dismissing this whole five-star movement as being a joke and a protest movement. And naturally, just like in all these kind of cases in the States and elsewhere, they refused to actually look at the substance of what this movement was saying and why people were voting for them. You can't discount that. Sure, a few people were voting for a protest, but the fact is they had a political program, and once they were elected, they went into opposition in the parliament. They enacted what they could in opposition, and the first thing that they did was to cut their salaries as deputies, as senators, and in their Congress. So they didn't wait for the excuse like, oh yeah, we have to pass a law or something. They just simply cut it. So, and the amount of money that these people make in the Italian system is truly obscene, especially compared to the average working people in this country who are lucky if they make €1,000 a month, maybe 1,100 euros a month. These people, the senators and so on, they make something like 15,000 euros a month. 15,000 euros a month. Plus travel expenses, plus this, plus that, and just this is on and on. Just there's so much stuff. It's grotesque. And so this was one of the first important moves that the five-star movement members did. They simply took more than half of their salary and they put it into a fund. That fund was not run by them, but within the bureaucratic institutions of the Italian government, which became microcredit for small businesses. We are now 4 years after this, and just a couple days ago, Beppe Grillo, the leader of the movement, and the various representatives of the movement, they did a symbolic signing of this gigantic check for 80 million euros. And all that money has started pizzerias and bakers and innovative little shops of any kind, people that want a chance. So here you have people doing a concrete thing for the people with the resources that they had. The other great thing that the five-star movement has done during these 4 years they've been in opposition is they're basically ratting on their colleagues. Because what's the usual story, like in America and everywhere else? Once the various parties pretend being in opposition during an election, once they're in power and they're legislating, which is the only real concrete result of any political process, is how do you legislate, right? What are the laws that come out? Who do they benefit? What are the consequences? So once they're actually in power, then it's the usual thing. Siphoning off enormous funds to save banks, saving their friends of their friends, giving tax breaks to multinationals, just doing the usual crap. And then when it's time to talk about sacrifice, then they're cutting the pensions of the poor, working people and things like that. And then all of a sudden there's not enough money for schools. We don't have it. Now we need rigor and we need austerity and blah, blah, blah. So the usual hypocritical shenanigans. And the beauty of the five-star movement being in power was they were denouncing this kind of mess from day one. And as the years have progressed, they've gotten, of course, better at it, because one of their the way that these elected representatives of the five-star movement came to be elected was through a web-based electoral system, like a primary system. And people just put little YouTube videos, and they submitted their resumes, and then people who were members, inscribed members, registered members within the community online could vote for them related to their various region or city or county or whatever. So these were people who were not just lawyers and bankers that were now becoming politicians. They were people of every different class of society, every, half women, half men, lots of different backgrounds. So there was a real big learning curve. These people didn't know what the hell they were doing when they got there, and they made an enormous amount of mistakes, and they were pilloried and mocked by the mainstream media for every false step. But now here we are 4 years later, and they've become incredibly media savvy, and a lot of them are bright and articulate, and they've stuck to their guns, and they've stuck to their program, and they have a program. This is another trick which the mainstream media always plays, and you remember this with the the Wall Occupy Wall Street movement. All of a sudden, the mainstream media no longer understands what people want. What do they want? What do they want? Well, anybody that wants to understand what these people want, you can find out what they want. It's always articulated. There's no that's a fantasy driven narrative of the mainstream media, that it's not understood what these people want. The program is very clear: public schools, public control of the water. I can't remember them all right off the bat, but cutting all these grotesque salaries, literally grotesque salaries of political leaders. Not to mention the pensions. There's people with pensions, senators and people like that their pension is 30,000 euros a month, which would be which really under no circumstances is justifiable. In any event, that's the situation we're in. And now you have a constitution. You have a constitution that was established and voted for in 1948 out of the ruins of the war. It's functioned all the way up till now. But all of a sudden, it doesn't work anymore, right? Renzi kind of, this is another story, and I don't want to go too far into it because I want to try to get this over with. But he was not elected. He took over the Democratic Party and basically kind of did an internal coup and got himself into being prime minister without going to an election. So Renzi, who's the sponsor, and all of his ministers of this constitutional referendum had no mandate to do this. And this constitutional this reform has been done by just some of the most lurid figures that have been in power for 50 years. These are people who have never gone anywhere, and they don't want to go anywhere. And the point of the referendum is to put an end to any kind of meaningful democratic participation of the majority of Italians. That's what it's for. The Senate alone, which they first kind of tried to tell everybody it was going to be abolished, it's not being abolished. But you know what they're going to do? They're going to have only representatives in the Senate that are mayors. So basically they're saying the mayors and regional presidents and stuff, they're going to get to be. So they will no longer be elected by the people. And it just so happens that currently the majority of mayors and the majority of presidents of regions are of the PD. What a surprise. So basically they want a Senate that won't be abolished, but it's just that it will no longer have a direct election by the Italian citizenry. And what's more, what else do they get? Parliamentary immunity. So at the level of cities, at the level of a region, is where you have here in Italy the most often scandals regarding corruption and bribes and all that kind of stuff. So all these people who, are headed to jail, they get nominated senators and go hide out there and get these grotesque sums of money. Italy has a long history of clientelism and favoritism and all these kind of patronage and all that stuff. So it has a lot to do with that. But under no circumstances is this a positive reform. It is basically to take the vote away from people. And why do they do that? What's the excuse? Well, they say that the Senate and the House of the Chamber of Deputies are too slow. They can't get anything done. Where have you heard that before? Well, guess what? When there was a big engineered economic crisis that was engineered by the usual global speculative forces, in 1 month it took, they passed a law cutting all of the people's pensions as a matter of sacrifice. Now, when it comes to cutting their own grotesque salaries, all of a sudden it's like, well, it's in a commission, blah, frickin' blah. So that, of course, is a fantasy. They have no problem. When Berlusconi years ago needed a new law for new immunity for himself for all of his illicit activity, wow, what do you know? They managed to get that through both houses of parliament and stamped and signed in less than a month as well. So when they want to do anything, they can do it as fast as they need to do it. But the fact is they don't want to do it because they're not there to legislate with it in the interest of the Italian people. So that's the context, that's what's happened, and that's why this reform has been going on. So remember, the vast majority of the media in Italy is the usual globalist corporate agenda. So they're all saying to everybody that you have to vote yes or C, as it is in this language. And no is the side of regression and the forces of evil and corruption and populism and all this stuff, which naturally includes this budding movement of incredibly enthusiastic, and for the most part, very clean and honest people who really love this country and want to see it improve. So they would love to have a reform, but they'd love to have a reform that cut all these grotesque salaries and ended parliamentary immunity. And the other thing that the Five Star Movement would do if they could actually do a real meaningful reform of the Constitution would be to no longer allow you to change party once you've been elected, because that's what these people do. You have no idea, if you looked at a single Italian politician and then you look behind them, how many times they've changed parties. Basically every year they invent a new symbol and a new party, and they just keep recycling themselves. And again, it's just to stay in power and to keep sucking the blood of this cow. Whereas the Five Star Movement refuses to make any kind of alliances with any of these figures, but of course, naturally, they just make alliances with themselves and just keep the ball rolling and keep the cash cow flowing. So the Five Star Movement says, if you want to change your political orientation, your party, you resign. You go back to the town you come from, and then you run again and get elected on a different platform, because, of course, you're betraying the will of the voters and the program that you supposedly were voted in on. So those would be real reforms. Now, finally, what's the consequence of this emptying the Constitution of representational power for the majority of the Italian people, to say it in a very simplified manner? Well, Europe. And what is Europe? What is the European Union? Unfortunately, as we all know, it had wonderful, noble ideas. It came out of the ashes of the Second World War and conflicting interests and nationalisms. But the fact is, those noble ideas of what it should have been for peace and social justice and all those kind of wonderful things have been completely emptied of any meaning that they might have originally had. It's nothing but a Trojan horse to expand the power and the influence of multinational corporations and the banks, and to make it easy for them to maximize their profits on any activities that they see fit. Now, how can you screw the maximum amount of people out of their pensions, out of their education system, out of all of their resources? Well, you can't do it if you have a democracy. So what's the trick there? Well, you make things as least democratic as possible. This trade agreement, the TTPP, that hopefully Trump is going to abandon anyway, would have pretty much ended independent, autonomous Italian agriculture. All the things that, if you come to Italy, that you love about its country, its culture, its traditions, its cuisine, all that kind of stuff, that's gone. You get to come here and eat McDonald's just like everybody else. That's what goes, is a country's individuality, because it's not profitable. What's profitable is maximizing homogeneity and maximizing, the exploitation of all of the resources, human, natural, be what they may. So how could you ever get the Italian parliament to ratify such a suicidal, ugly thing? Well, if you have a parliament that's made up of collaborators who have no interest or desire to represent the actual interests of the Italian people, but they are, in fact, agents of the plutocracy, and they have a parliament that they've basically turned into a rubber stamp, well, all of a sudden it becomes easy to screw your own people and do that. And that's exactly what will happen. Maybe not with the TTPP, but in any other, there'll be other contact. They'll find plenty of things to do. So this is why this reform that will be voted on Sunday is utterly a scam. There's nothing redeeming about it. And as usual, guess who's supporting it? J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, all of the European Union bureaucrats, and international global finance. And of course, just like the Brexit, just like with Trump, just like with everything else, if the people actually vote no, then the world's going to end and we're all screwed and it's all going to be horrible. But naturally, if they vote C, then we're going to enter a land of milk and honey and we're each going to get 70 virgins and everything's going to be wonderful. That's exactly what they told us when the European Union came into effect, and that's what they tell us every time they want to screw us some more, how wonderful it's going to be, when naturally the only people who get amply rewarded for their duplicity and their collaboration with these forces are the elites who communicate this claptrap. Well, I hope that my comments have given you a better idea of what's going on here. I know that it's a lot of information, but you can't. It's hard to understand the present if you don't go a bit into the past regarding why Italy is the way it is, why it has the system it has, how it functions, and so on. I appreciate your comments and criticism. I'm not interested. I have my opinions. I'm not necessarily interested in conditioning anyone else's. I'd rather base what I say on the correct information. If you want to see the opposite point of view and basically a shill hit piece on BuzzFeed, there is an article about the Five-Star Movement, which is basically just just a half truths and insinuations, and there's some true things that are in it, but then it's contextualized in a manner that makes the Five-Star Movement look bad. But of course they have to make it look bad because they're on the side of those crappy forces that we're all fed up with. So I guess I'll say adios.